Turner wanted more participation. So definitely he felt, and I agree, that you really, you can learn something by watching, and then you record the behavior, and of course there's a lot of my work that does that. But you can also begin to understand the behavior you're recording, and if you have participated in it. I'm not saying that you become Lawrence of Arabia and go native, but you have to really get inside the culture's embodied experience, embodied knowledge, to begin to understand. You want to see with the eyes of the other, and these are ancient performance or acting techniques, so they can be used. Actors learn by imitation, they learn by emotional recall, they learn by putting themselves in somebody else's circumstances. We call it the given circumstances. Like for example, if you want to experience the sadness of I don't know, of Ophelia, of the death of her father, you have to imagine those given circumstances. I have a beloved father, so you say, who is it in my life, not necessarily my father, who's really beloved of me? And can I imagine, or has anybody who's really been beloved of me suddenly died? It couldn't, maybe not murdered, but suddenly died. And if I can imagine, so a person says, no, I don't have any such person. Well, did you have a pet? Did you have a pet that died? And well, not really. Well, did you have something that you lost? Your pen, your ring. Finally, you find something that can stand in for something, and in that way, recalling how you felt when you lost your ring, or misplaced, or when your pet died, or when, depending, you can begin to reawaken the emotions that attended that event, and then those emotions, that experience, will be applied to the event at hand. That's the exercise of affective memory or emotional recall. And I'm sure that somebody like Kathy Bisoli, who was playing the mannequin and was weeping, was doing some degree of emotional recall. Some kind of circumstance. And we saw her on a dumpster, but her experience may have been something else. But you have to understand that, though, you begin to, all right, so experiencing is your self-experiencing, and empathy is connected to theory of mind and reflected in fMRI mirror neurons, that one actually is having the experience of another. Not just appreciating the experience of another, that would be sympathy, but empathy. And of course, it's a fuzzy boundary between sympathy and empathy. So very often, for example, earlier we were doing this business of contagion, of salivating, but early on in a nursery, one child begins to cry, they all begin to cry. It's not that something is, the first child cries, maybe it's uncomfortable, and the second child is not uncomfortable, but is empathizing. They're lighting up emotionally exactly what the first child. We're a species that has to learn how to shut out empathy, not learn how to have empathy. We're inherently, as early infants and children, very empathic to others, and emotions are very contagious. And then we learn to control it, because it's a little bit dangerous unless we can control it. But we know that, for example, a parent for a child will feel something in his stomach when that child feels something that a stranger won't feel. And that's because they're mapped onto that child, and not simply that they're genetically similar. I don't think it is genetic, because I think if you had an adopted child from an infant, you would have the same thing. But you're mapped, and so that their experience becomes your experience. I think Turner was very interested in saying not only, so it's the other side of not only the behavior being described, but the experience being felt. And that's where, so I would say behavior, if I did restoration of behavior, I would now should do a restoration of an experience, or believing embodiment, and that leads to Rasa boxes and so on, all that more recent than the restoration of behavior. I'm not saying the restoration of behavior is invalidated. I think it's a very strong theory. But I do think embodiment is an equally strong theory, and it connects to taking on the body of the other, or the gestures of the other, in order to experience what the other is experiencing, something parallel to that. And I think he was very much into that, and I agree. I think that's a very powerful tool, and that it warms up anthropology. I think anthropology, in its classical sense, sometimes is too cold. In other words, if you read Malinowski's ethnographies and then read his notebooks, you would like more the notebooks to be in the ethnography, right? I mean, the notebook is all these complications and so on. Or it's interesting if you read a novel like Heart of Darkness. So you get a vision of a colonial exploitation and a certain kind of anthropology that's going on, the descriptions and so on and so forth, but you're getting it from a highly experientialized, obviously it's a novel, but it's a very powerful novel. I think ethnographers should read that novel, because it also gives a feeling of, at that time, between the 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th centuries, how people felt going into so-called, what we now call other cultures or exotic cultures, but which they felt truly were savage and dangerous cultures. And the horror. I mean, they had that feeling, even though they repressed it, and that affected those kind of ethnographers. They tried to understand, but they had a hard time experiencing and empathizing. So now we live in a different world. At the same time, Diana Taylor, we had a discussion this morning, a performance studies colleague of mine, and she said that human rights trump cultural rights. We had this discussion. We were talking about female circumcision, cruelty to children, and so on. And she says, no, always human rights must. And I was saying, I agree from my perspective, but I also think human rights are relative. In other words, so that I agree, and because I am who I am, but I can't say that they're inalienable. You know, I think we have to work for them, and I don't think we can impose them. I think we have to persuade, because we do change cultures. And so the yin and the yang, for me, I'm always going back and forth between what I think is right and just and good, and from the point of view of human rights, and what I think is right and just and good from the point of view of non-intervention. Because I've seen, let's say, unintended consequences of good actions. The most extreme one, it's horrible that I'm going to say this on tape, but I will say it because I've thought it, is the introduction of modern medicine, which leads to overpopulation. So we don't want people to die of diseases, but unless you introduce, along with the cure, effective economic raising up and birth control and population control, the consequence of saving the lives will be to wreck the lives. So we always have to think that there's a yin and yang to all our actions, even the best of our actions. And it would be easy to say that George Bush went into Iraq just for the oil. Okay, that's terrible, and I'm sure that was a big part of it. But I also think ideologically he thought he was overturning a dictator and would bring democracy. That's where you get the liminoid tragic coming in, that people have mixed motives. They're not, and one doesn't cancel out the other. You can say, yeah, I want the oil, and yeah, this guy is a bad guy and will make the country better, etc. So then, do we intervene? Do we not intervene? Who are the we? Certainly the early missionaries thought that they were bringing enlightenment with Christianity. There's no doubt that they thought that. They didn't think they were simply exploiting these people and getting more money for the churches. They thought they were bringing the saviorhood of Jesus Christ. They were believers. It would be much too easy to think that everyone is a cynic. They're cynics. But many people really feel they do good. I think part of the way we can recuperate, if you will, good anthropology is to train anthropologists from other cultures to study us. Not simply, one of the critiques of anthropology I have, and I know it's not one of your immediate questions, is that when somebody comes, let's say, from South Asia or from Indonesia or from Africa, and they train as anthropologists, it's almost assumed that they will go back to their country and do anthropology there. When we train a Euro-American, whether Brazilian Euro-American or North American, or it's almost assumed that they will do work in some, quote, for them, exotic place, not among their own people. You don't train people here to do, I'm not talking about the Amazonian, I mean to do what we would call sociology. I always thought of sociology as the anthropology of the West on the West. You know, I mean, Durkheim is as important to anthropology, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel that when we train anthropologists, there should be more anthropological studies done of the, you know, the famous Namarica book, you know, right, the Americans. So, yeah, right. So we should be having people from Central Africa doing studies in Sao Paulo of European peoples, and writing anthropological ethnographies to be published back in Nigeria about these strange people that exotic people, and which we have to have this, either eliminate the notion of exoticism altogether or make it really back and forth. And to do that, of course, we then have to think about our methodologies, indigenous methodologies, all those questions.
The second part of my question has to do with the fourth and fifth moment mentioned by Turner. The fourth moment, he says, when images of the past articulate the present, it's like meaning is created. It becomes meaningful, and the last moment has to do with expression. Right. And I would be interested in your thoughts on those two particular moments. Is meaning always created in experience? And
Well, I think meaning is created through interpretation. There I'd be more along with Geertz rather than I would be with Turner in that regard. In other words, I think meaning is an interpretation of behavior, making it into an action, as we said before. I don't think meaning is inherent in actions. I think meanings are inherent in actions on the part of the person who's behaving, but I am also a Freudian to the degree that we're not always aware of the meaning we're conveying. And you know, there are lots of psychoanalysis that I would reject as being mystical and opaque and all of that. But some of the underlying assumptions that we can do things and not know what we're doing, I think is absolutely true. You know, and the second underlying assumption is that dreams can speak to us. I think is absolutely true, and I think that's something that where modern culture, Freudian culture, and traditional cultures really convey, are in harmony. Both say that dreams are extremely important as conveyors of knowledge, and Freud said the royal road to the unconscious, and so on. So meaning, you know, the Turner's notion that through experience we get meaning, correct, but meaning is through self-interpretation and interpretation of the others. Meaning is not inherent in the action. Excuse me. Meaning is not inherent in the behavior. Meaning is what is made from the behavior. And this I know so well from theater, because as a theater director, I'm using gestures all the time, and then I have to decide how to make them mean what I want them to mean. The gesture itself has much less, quote, natural meaning than you think it would have, like blowing a kiss. Okay, isn't that clear a meaning? But what if Iago does it to Othello? You know, and we know the story of what's happening between the two. Then what does that blow and kiss mean? So Juliet doing it to Romeo and Iago, same behavior, totally different meaning. You got to know the context, etc. There's nothing inherent in the blowing of a kiss that says I love you. It may say many things. So there's where I feel one should not be naive, because also in ordinary life by ordinary people, it's not only in high art, gestures mean their opposite. There's a famous account from Poland that I'll give you. So there was, during the period of Solidarity, before Solidarity was very strong, there was martial law in Poland, and a famous actor had supported the government, and he was very well hated by the people. But you couldn't really demonstrate against him at the time. You get thrown in jail. So there was a performance. They agreed. They went to a performance that this actor was giving after he had come out in favor of the government, and they didn't like it. And when he appeared on stage the first time, everybody stood up and gave him a standing ovation. He was so happy. He felt, they understood him. And so he began to utter his first line, and they stood up again. In other words, they kept giving him standing ovations until, humiliated, he had to leave the stage. But what could he complain about? That he was being applauded. So the communication was very, very clear. Not at the beginning. It went from positive to extremely negative by using a gesture that no censor, no government could say was wrong, because all they could say is, we're so happy with this man, we're so proud of him. But he never was able to give his performance.
It is interesting.
So there's how the human intelligence, the ability of gesture and so on. I don't think an animal can do the same thing, but to some degree, evolutionarily, animals who mimic, who disguise, who camouflage, chameleon-like things, they're doing similar things, but not through agency, but through natural selection. Mm-hmm. So I think this business of expression even then is context specific. I'm very much a context specific person, because within the framework of theater where I practice my art, everything is in quotation marks. That's why J.L. Austin didn't think any utterance on stage was a performative, because it was always in quotation marks. And I agree with Goffman. Gestures and statements in life are in quotation marks as well. Mm-hmm. The only thing that is different between the stage and life is that we emphasize it. We're pointed to it. It's put under, like when a stain reveals the real shape of the cell. It's shown more. Yeah. It's not that in ordinary life we're always being authentic and doing real performatives as Austin would say, but more like Goffman. We perform in everyday life, and we perform with a heightened sense of awareness on the stage. But we also perform in everyday life. That is, we deceive, we put things in quotation marks, we mean various things. So you also need to know the context of everyday life. And I think, the people that we feel are masters of traditional knowledge, shamans, the people like Penguin, the teachers, they're very often very cunning. And that's they're both accepted and feared because they're cunning, because they can speak with many different tongues, because they can master, as it were, expression. So I think these are things we should take into account.